By way of background, Threshold is a national housing charity that's been providing frontline services and help to people with housing problems since 1978 in Ireland in the private rental sector. Specifically, Threshold has, since its origin, been advocating for a better housing system. And again, even in terms of the present crisis last year, Threshold was responsible for preventing over 10,000 adults and children from entering into a state of homelessness. The well-documented supply crisis in terms of long-term rental properties in this country is not something that I need to further address here today. Specifically since 2018, Threshold has been campaigning for the regulation of short-term lettings as it became apparent that their popularity in Ireland was disruptive to the supply of long-term rental properties. In terms of the forthcoming bill, when enacted, Threshold's position is that we obviously welcome anything that will result in a significant return of properties to the long-term rental market, and we're aware that probably the figure that's been put forward most commonly is that by Fáilte Ireland of a potential 12,000 properties returning, which is, as we say, significant and most welcomed in this time of crisis. Our position in respect of the forthcoming bill is that it is comprehensive. Having said that, we would also point out that there are a number of recommendations that we would also make, and I wish to turn to those now. Firstly, the proposed bill does not specify that people engaging in home sharing will be subject to the same requirements as others operating in the short-term letting market. We submit that this needs to be addressed more clearly in the bill or set out in the associated regulations with due consideration given to administrative burdens that could be placed on home sharers. I want to be absolutely clear on this, that Threshold have never had any objection to people in their principal residence letting out a room on a short-term basis. Our core objective would really relate actually to entire apartments or entire homes and the possibility of returning those to the long-term rental market. People renting out a room within their principal residence is something that we've never objected to, and likewise we've never raised objections to the rent-a-room scheme. Turning then to the second recommendation that we would make, and this concerns the definition of short-term lets that's provided in the general scheme and its conflict with Section 3A of the Planning and Development Act 2000 as amended. We note that there is a conflict between both pieces of legislation, and we also note the extension of, in regard to the definition of what constitutes a short-term let from 14 to 21 days. We would simply seek a further explanation as to why this extension has occurred. Following on from that, we note that any updates to the regulations for short-term accommodation rental 2018 on foot of amendments to the Tourist Acts must not remove the requirement to provide certificates of compliance with planning permission in order for a property to be eligible for registration on the register of short-term tourist lettings. Essentially what we're getting at here is we understand that the legislative process will require a revision of some of the existing registers that are already in place and the requirements that attach to them. Turning then to the actual definition of information society services as set out in the general scheme, we note that this is not a readily available definition and simply points to the definition provided by a European directive. Again, we're seeking more clarity on this and a straightforward definition of what an ISS actually constitutes. The obligation on information society services to collect and display registration numbers is of key importance. And we recognise that presently the only requirement of ISSs or platforms is to essentially make their best efforts in regard to essentially checking the validity of registration numbers. We don't believe this is sufficient, and we believe that it's a core aspect of enforcing compliance, and that essentially the platforms, the ISSs, have to share the burden in ensuring that this process is effectively carried out in order to ensure that this Act has teeth. And then finally, turning to the last of our recommendations, and that relates to the financial sanctions in place. And we feel that the financial sanctions that apply under the forthcoming bill in respect of the ISSs are insufficient and are unrealistic and are not reflective of their turnover figures. The maximum financial sanction that can apply to them is €5,000, and this pales in insignificance to the financial sanctions and punishments that can apply to proprietors, which can reach as high as €50,000 and up to 5 years imprisonment for not being in compliance with the legislation. And we would simply call for a revision of the potential sanctions that can apply to ISSs, as I say, to be reflective of their turnover figures.